Warning: All Things Crime is a true crime production that may contain violent or disturbing material. Viewer or listener discretion is advised. For solid forensics evidence, blood stain, DNA, some of that's up to interpretation, but most of it is just science. And science doesn't care who it's for, the defense or the prosecution. And it doesn't really care what the outcome of the case is. Science is science, and it shouldn't ever lie. All right, everybody, welcome to All Things Crime, another episode. Thanks for watching and listening, and we are so excited to bring you another episode today, and we have a special guest on this morning. Her name is Anita Zannin. Did I pronounce that right, Anita?
Zannin.
Zannin. I knew, you know what? Even if I asked you, I knew I would slaughter it. So Zannin, sorry about that.
That's okay.
Yeah, but as you know, we are here to help educate everybody about the criminal investigation process. And Anita is an expert in blood spatter and blood stain analysis, as well as crime scene and other. She has other areas of expertise. Then I'll let her explain a lot of that. But let's start with kind of what your background is, how you got started in what you're doing now.
Well, I kind of fell into it by accident. A lot of people have law enforcement backgrounds and things like that do what I do. My background is primarily medical. I worked in an emergency room for about 17 years and on the donor side of organ and tissue transplant for about 15 years. And when I went back to school, I wanted to go for behavioral profiling, that sort of thing, but there really weren't the programs that there are now. And so I ended up in a forensic chemistry program that required an internship, and I knew that I did not want to be in a lab all day. So I ended up doing an internship with Herb McDonald, who's widely recognized as the father of blood stain pattern analysis in this part of the world, and ended up loving it. And here I am 17 years later, still doing it.
I would have never guessed, like I said, 15 years ago, that I would be where I am now. And so I was in a completely different field, was headed toward management in the pharmaceutical industry. And then one day my dad called me and he said, "Hey, I want you to come work for me." And so that started a whole chain of events. And we started with I know you're familiar with the M-Vac and how it works as a, spraying a solution down a vacuum up DNA. But that started, you may not know, in the food industry.
No, I did not.
Yeah, it started with collecting E. coli and salmonella and stuff like that. And
Wow.
yeah, and then I ran into an old college buddy, and he said, "Hey, that'd be great on some of my crime scenes." He worked for the FBI at the time, and so yeah, we pivoted in 2012, and we've been doing it ever since. So who knows where you're going to be?
Yeah, for sure.
So talk about where I know with AZ Forensics, you have different areas of expertise. Talk about some of the things that you do in particular when an agency would call you for help.
Yeah, so my primary areas of expertise are blood stain pattern analysis and crime scene investigation. I have other colleagues that do fingerprints, and I have a wide network of colleagues that I can refer folks to if they need other expertise. A lot of times when I evaluate a case, I'll see something and suggest that they need another type of expert that they may not have thought of. So typically the way it goes is that I'm contacted either by the prosecution, defense, plaintiff or defense, or even police departments while they are investigating a case. They kind of give me the rundown on what's going on, and then they send me the materials to review, and I come to an opinion. And what a lot of people don't realize is that it's pretty common that information provided is either not useful to them, or the opinion is in direct contradiction with their theory of the case. And so a lot of people think that experts just say what they're paid to say. And you don't see the cases where it's not uncommon at all for me to review a case, maybe for the defense, and say, well, this isn't so good for your guy. You should probably try and get a plea here. Those things never make it into the news, but that happens far more often than I actually go testify.
How true is that? There are so many times that I've talked to folks like you and even active investigators that they're like, the best thing is you go where the evidence takes you. And in fact, I love that little saying on your website. It said opinions and memories change, but evidence never lies. Something to that effect. And I probably butchered that too. So, but no, it's totally true, because evidence, solid forensics evidence, blood stain, DNA, some of that's up to interpretation, but most of it is just science. And science doesn't care who it's for, the defense or the prosecution. And it doesn't really care what the outcome of the case is. Science is science, and it shouldn't ever lie, right?
It shouldn't, and the science itself doesn't, but some practitioners might. Whether they lie or they are uneducated or whatever. The fact of the matter is, a lot of times on TV you hear, oh, it's a circumstantial case. Well, forensic evidence is circumstantial evidence, because it doesn't tell you the who and the when. Eyewitness testimony is direct evidence, but all of the other forensic disciplines there's an element of subjectivity to them, even DNA, particularly when it comes to mixtures. Subjectivity doesn't necessarily equal bad or unreliable. And just like any other field, there's good forensic scientists and there's bad forensic scientists. There's good lawyers and bad lawyers. And so the science itself is not problematic, but sometimes there's individual practitioners that can be problematic.
So how do you vet that?
Well, that's really the lawyer's job to vet the experts. But that is often what my job is to review an opposing expert's work. And again, it never makes it on the news when my opinion is, nope, this looks fine. There's no problem here. The only things that make it onto the media is when we do differ.
So maybe explain a little bit, especially in your realm of expertise, how your opinion would differ from somebody else's.
In bloodstain pattern analysis, more often than not, there is more than one way a particular pattern can be formed, and they look very similar. For instance, impact spatter from a gunshot wound can resemble, or I should say expirated blood that comes out of the nose, mouth, or other like a chest wound, anything under air pressure can resemble impact spatter, either from a beating or a gunshot wound, depending on the force with which the blood is expelled. Because the greater the force, the smaller the blood stains. So if somebody is really coughing, sneezing, that sort of stuff, it'll be very, very small blood stains, much like we see with gunshots. And if they're a little less forceful, it may be a little bigger drops like we see with beatings, and even really large drops if maybe their face is laying in a pool of blood and they're just barely breathing into it, we'll get very large stains. So you have to really take into consideration all possible mechanisms. I have a case right now where somebody was shot in the neck. So we've got arterial spurting, we've got forward spatter, back spatter, satellite spatter, which is when blood drips into blood and you get the tiny spatters all around the major pool of blood, and expirated blood. All of those things can have a very similar size, shape, and distribution. So if you can't rule out those mechanisms, you have to include them as possibilities in your opinions. And sometimes that doesn't happen. Sometimes somebody can get kind of tunnel vision, or maybe they don't realize that one of the mechanisms is possible, and that sort of thing.
So how long did it take you to actually become confident in this kind of especially in blood spatter?
I would say years. Because there's so many variables, and even now, I double check things with colleagues and get their input, because as long as there's humans involved in the process, we can't think of every single thing, and it's always good to have another perspective and to see if there's another way to look at it that you didn't consider.
Right. So what would you consider to be the most difficult type of blood spatter to identify?
That's a good question. I think the cases where there are multiple overlapping patterns and victims can be difficult and sometimes impossible to interpret.
Hmm. So I had a case in, I want to say it was South Africa that we were discussing, and it was a double homicide. The two victims were related, a mom and a daughter, and they were laying in a bed, and they were essentially attacked with an axe. And so the obviously the blood spatter was everywhere, on the walls, on the ceiling. And the interesting thing about it was there was a dresser next to the bed, and based on where the suspect was standing, the blood spatter on that dresser was really minimal. And just the assumption is the suspect was standing there the majority of the time, and it was the suspect was actually a female, so it was a female on double female homicide, and I think that's fairly rare by itself. But the way that they determined, well, obviously there was a lot of determinations coming out of there, but one of the biggest ones was that the suspect was standing in front of that chest of drawers basically the majority of the time. Obviously you would need to see pictures and all sorts of things, but just based on that scenario, is there anything that you would not interpret, but anything that you would expect on blood spatter, analysis and patterns that you would expect from that?
Well, what you're describing is a relative void, and that's where something blocks the deposition of blood on another object. And therefore you might expect your suspect to be covered in blood. So in that sort of scenario, you would expect to see impact spatter, Castoff, depending on where their injuries were and how long they survived, potentially expirated blood. I just had a thought that completely derailed.
Oh, well, while you're thinking of it, it never works to, think about it too much. So
Of course.
When you said impact spatter,
Mm-hmm.
so kind of briefly describe what those are.
So impact spatter is when a source of liquid blood has an external force applied to it. Back in the early days, it used to be categorized as low velocity impact spatter, medium velocity impact spatter, and high velocity impact spatter. And those were characterized by the amount of force that impacted the blood, not the velocity that the blood was traveling. So low would be approximately 5 to 25 feet per second. Medium would be 25 to 75, and high would be greater than 100 feet per second. But because there's such overlap in the categories and the way those patterns can appear, they've gotten away from describing it as low, medium, and high velocity impact spatter, and it's just called impact spatter, and then consistent with a gunshot wound or consistent with a beating, consistent with a stabbing, that sort of thing.
So a stabbing would be high impact or low impact?
Nope. If we went with that categorization, it would be medium, but we would just say it's impact spatter consistent with a stabbing.
Okay. So this one would be impact spatting or impact spatter.
Mm-hmm.
consistent with an axe. And I think the investigators, and obviously there was blood everywhere, but I think the investigators were especially surprised at how much blood was even on the ceiling. How would it get up there?
That's from Castoff, and that happens when an object covered in blood is swung by the as you swing it, it comes off of the object by the centrifugal force. And each time the object comes down, the blood is replenished on the object. So you get changing directionalities with the upswing and the downswing. And there are some specific characteristics that we look for, such as the change in directionality, at each point where the object is 90 degrees from the surface, we'll have round drops. And some people call those pivot points because then the directionality starts to change in the other way. And there's typically a linear distribution, but how that appears depends on the surface area from which the blood is cast. So like something from a knife, it's going to be very thin and linear versus like a baseball bat. It has a much larger surface area. So the cast-off pattern might be a lot wider, although still linear.
That is so interesting. There are just so many different factors that go into every kind of crime like this.
Oh, absolutely.
Well, every crime scene. And that's one of the things that I think people are so fascinated with, is that every crime scene is its own puzzle.
Right.
And the expertise needed to actually walk into a crime scene and say, yes, I can actually process this versus, I'm way in over my head just based on looking at this. So, which brings up a good question, I think. What, in your mind, when you are giving classes and things like that, is there any kind of a point when you recommend to crime scene investigators, say, look, if you're uncomfortable, you need to stop and call for help, or something like that? Is there any kind of a trigger point that people need to be aware of?
Well, that's a really great question. I think that kind of opens a bigger can of worms here. So I'll step on my soapbox for a minute.
Okay. I love soapboxes. Bring it on.
Well, how long do we have?
Yeah.
So, according to the rules of evidence, somebody's an expert if they have knowledge that's greater than that of the average person by knowledge, education, training, experience. So somebody that has taken a basic 40-hour blood stain course can be accepted as an expert. Now, basic 40-hour courses do not make you an expert in the field. And everybody I know that teaches them tells their students that. What they do, you're creating patterns under ideal circumstances in a laboratory, and learning about them under ideal circumstances, not in the life or death struggle of a crime scene. And so what a 40-hour course allows you to do is to be able to identify some basic patterns, document them properly, and photograph them properly for an expert. And unfortunately, whether it's pressures from departments or things like that, folks kind of get pushed into going further than maybe they should in their analysis and what they can do with it. Well, we sent you to that class, you should be able to do this. So, there's a lot of things that go into it. And obviously every person's tolerance is going to be a little bit different based on their training, education, and experience. So I think whenever they feel like they're in over their head, they need to try and get help. And whether they get it or not is, of course, another story. But knowing your own limitations is really huge. And being able to take a step back and say, you know what, this is too much for me, instead of trying to slog your way through it. Because, once it's done, once you're done with that scene, that's the only chance you get. And, you don't want 20 years down the line stuff being reversed and all of that because you didn't have the wherewithal to say, you know what, this is too much for me.
Yeah. In many ways, I look at processing evidence or investigations almost the same way that some of these guys, especially I'm a veteran. And so I was in the Army for a number of years. And there's a lot of guys that I know and hear of where they'll look at like PTSD and things like that after extremely traumatic events. And in many ways, they're just kind of like, I'm just going to gut my way through it. And what I think we're learning more and more is that the true strength comes when they actually make that decision to get help.
Yes.
And I think that's kind of a human nature, is that especially if we have any level of expertise in a certain area, the last thing we want to do is appear weak and that we're unqualified, that we need help in a certain area. And regardless of whether it's psychological or physical, or in this case, crime scenes. And I think that, like you said, some people, they've gone through a basic course. And so they may be pressured to say, hey, look, we can handle this. But I think the true strength comes from when somebody said, and I'm not saying like a 12-year-old or a 12-year crime scene investigator veteran, needs to stop and call, other experts all the time. But for a major case, the true strength to me is saying, you know what, let's just make sure we do it right.
Right. And first of all, thank you for your service.
Oh, you're welcome.
And you kind of bring up another point with PTSD that I think is probably worth talking about as well. When I grew up through the emergency room and things like that, it was very much the same thing, that no matter what we saw, dealt with, you just suck it up and go on to the next one, and nobody talked about it. And I think that is shifting in a lot of agencies. And, there's a recognition that this repeated exposure to really awful things affects us. And they make their resources available, which I think is a good thing, and would encourage people to, when you start dreaming about your job, it's probably time to talk to somebody.
Yeah. Well, there's do you know Dr. Lee Meller?
I don't.
Okay. He's how do you even describe Dr. Miller? I mean, he has expertise in serial killings and rapings and the really major stuff. And I had just an amazing conversation with him. Well, I've had multiple major, conversations with him, but particularly here on all things crime. And he was talking about the two different areas of, especially investigating criminal matters, is there's what he calls the sewer, which is just all the garbage that you see, everything from like what we're talking about, major blood spatters to, because okay. And then, so that's the major, just the physical aspects of it. And then he calls it the abyss, which is kind of the why behind it. And I think that the abyss, trying to understand something, especially if there is no understanding, as humans and as people, as moms and dads and brothers and sisters, and just humans in general, a lot of this stuff we just can't comprehend, especially if we're looking at it through normal people eyes. Right. And these officers and investigators and detectives and blood spatter experts like yourself, it takes a toll. Just like, all those that are working in the emergency room. I've talked to multiple nurses and ER folks that were working through COVID, that the added stress and the added pressure of, especially the unknown, back a year or more ago, we really didn't know much about COVID. And so the stress was just unbelievable.
Right.
And, they see people dying everywhere. And just relating to that, I think is really, really impactful on people, which is why only a select few can actually do it.